You might be curious why we chose to read the books of Hebrews and James after the book of Matthew. There's a very good reason for this, and it's worth talking about for a little bit. You see, Hebrews and James represent probably the most Jewish of the New Testament documents. Now, people might argue for Jude being in there, and I won't contradict that, but Jude is such a short book, it's very difficult to really analyze other than say it alludes to literature from the Second Temple Judaism and practices from that. Hebrews and James, however, reflect something that we call the oral literary exchange. What that means is that in the ancient world, writing and speech, written history and oral history interacted. They fed off of each other. They had a symbiotic relationship with one another. And when we read the Hebrew scriptures, we read the New Testament, we tend to read them as if they were written exclusively in the written format. But in reality, what we often have, and we particularly have in Hebrews and James, is a sort of spoken written work. In other words, if you take Hebrews and rather than reading it like a letter, like an epistle, like one of Paul's books, and you instead read it as a sermon or as a discourse on a particular theological concept, especially if you read it as the understanding of what Christian or perhaps better Jewish believers in Jesus as the Christ, how they are working their way through what it means to be a follower of Christ in a world where Christianity and Judaism are diverging, it makes a lot more sense. You can see why Hebrews adopts some rather unique, still Jewish, but rather unique approaches to passages in the Hebrew scriptures. And likewise, James really gives us a glimpse into a community of believers who are following Jesus as the Christ, and yet they are still very Jewish in their mindset, and so morality and ethics and relationships are explained in Jewish terms for the Jewish mind. So when we read them, what we're reading is the interaction not of books that were written to be read aloud, all right, or written to be read as written works, but rather they are works that are an interplay of orality and textuality. And so they are best read aloud, and they are best thought of in terms of not these are written words to be treated line by line by line, but rather first and foremost to be read as a whole, and then we can consider the individual arguments within the whole. Think about a Sunday sermon. If I preach a Sunday sermon, you do not want to take each individual sentence of that sermon and try to make a value judgment based on it. You want to listen to the whole sermon and make decisions on meaning and intent based on the whole thing. And that's how we interpret orality as opposed to the way we interpret textuality, which is things that are written point by point by point by point by point. So enjoy reading these two books, maybe aloud, because they will make a lot more sense to you if you read them as a whole rather than trying to break them up into little pieces.